So joining me is former MP Ann Widdecombe. Ann, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Hello.
Do you think that International Women's Day is still a necessity in this day and age?
No, I don't. And I think it's pretty patronising. We don't have an International Men's Day. I do see the point of drawing attention to the plight of women in particular parts of the world where, for example, there isn't women's education or women bear a disproportionate amount of the burden of carrying water, etc., etc. There are things, useful things that you can say. But I didn't hear many of these useful things said.
But that's the point, isn't it? I mean, there are certain states in this world of ours where misogyny is built in to the system. I mean, if you think of Saudi Arabia, for example, women in Saudi Arabia simply don't have the rights that we have. Do you think that maybe it's a matter of priorities and that feminists should be looking outward a little bit more?
Well, I certainly think feminists should be looking outwards, but I also think, look, let's be totally realistic about this. Saudi Arabia isn't going to change its policies because we have International Women's Day. That is something that you build up pressure over time. I just think we ought to get a sense of proportion now. It's International Everything Day. As I say, I think there are issues. Those issues need addressing. I am not convinced that they're addressed by a day devoted to women.
Are you suggesting that the Taliban won't change their view on women after a few hashtags, Anne? Because I'm not sure. Maybe it's more powerful than you think. But you yourself,
I actually think the Taliban might not even bother reading the stuff.
I don't know. They're very much active online, I'll tell you that. But Anne, you have benefited insofar as that you came up through the ranks as a politician at a time when surely it must have been particularly difficult as a woman. You owe a lot to feminism, do you not?
I do not. I was a 1970s feminist when our line was, all we want is equality, give us equality, level playing field. We'll show you we're as good as, and in some cases better than the men. That was the challenge the feminists threw out in the 70s, when I may remind you that was a period when it was perfectly lawful, it was when I was a graduate, for an employer to advertise one job with two rates of pay underneath, one for men and one for women. That was lawful. That was what we were fighting then. But in the 90s, all that changed. And it suddenly became one massive whinge. Oh dear, we haven't made it on a level playing field. Now we want that playing field tilted towards us. Now we want quotas. We want all women shortlists. We want positive discrimination. That, to me, is not feminism, and I owe nothing to that sort of feminism. I owe it to those of us who, like me, were asking for equality. We never wanted the whinging rot now. I can remember it being said in the 70s, oh dear, you women talk about equality, but you have this thing every month and you go through the menopause. And we said, nothing to do with it, no worse than a winter chill. What's the fuss about? Now, firms are supposed to have menopause policies and the whole thing's gone absolutely bonkers.
So are you suggesting, Anne, that you feel that there's a kind of a way in which feminism has taken a turn to the extent where women are saying we're victims, we're weak, and your approach would be very different, I suppose?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, if you think of the suffragettes who were campaigning for the vote, they didn't whinge, they didn't talk about victimhood. And if you look at the 70s feminists who really were fighting serious inequality, they didn't talk about victimhood. But now, the truth is, we won. And there's never such a thing as the cause complete. Somebody's always then got to find something else to try and have a grievance about. And so having won, it's now changed completely.
But do you accept, though, I mean, misogyny still exists. There are still sexist men in positions of power.
So does misandry. So does misandry still exist?
But is that not less frequent, shall we say, than misogyny? And I suppose the counter-argument would be that some of the things you mentioned there about having two different rates of pay for the same work, which we would think is unthinkable, and yet it takes quite a long time, doesn't it, to dismantle the effects of that in society. Do you not think there's still a fight to be had?
And that practice became unlawful. And when women say now, oh dear, our pay isn't equal to the men, it's because of all manner of things, such as, for example, that women are far more likely to work part-time than men. So that has a massive impact on the statistics. Women are far more likely to take time out to have children than men. That has a massive impact on the statistics. None of that is ever taken into account. It's whinge, whinge, whinge. Well, I ain't no whinger, and I object to people like you patronising me and telling me I'm a victim of misogyny, because I jolly well am not.
That sounds a lot like internalised misogyny to me, Anne. I don't mean it, by the way, and I'm absolutely not accusing you of that at all. But look, you know, it does feel to me like your perspective on this is perhaps the marginal one, and that certainly looking at some of the tweets around International Women's Day, is that a lot of women saw it as an opportunity to be proud and to actually take a positive spin on things and say, look at what women have achieved, and isn't this wonderful?
Yes, and I'm all in favour of that. I'm all in favour of celebrating what's been achieved. Have you noticed how so often when people are talking about women in politics, they manage not to mention Margaret Thatcher, whose achievement, you know, was the greatest political achievement of women. She was the first woman prime minister, and yet people somehow seem to manage not quite to mention her so much. And I do want to celebrate what we've achieved, but I want to celebrate what the world's achieved. I want to celebrate what the men have achieved as well. People like Jenner and smallpox, you know, Pasteur and anthrax. I want to celebrate what Marie Curie for a woman. I want to celebrate what everybody's achieved. I don't want to be singled out into this patronised division which says, oh dear, you're a woman. Let me tell you a story, a very quick story.
Absolutely.
When all the Blair babes came in, 101 of them, you might remember, in Parliament, we might as well have had 101 Dalmatians, and they all came in, and about 6 months after they came in, one of them came up to me in a corridor, and she said to me, in the House of Commons, she said to me, Anne, isn't it horrible how the men are so rude to us? And I said, yes. And isn't it horrible how they're so rude to each other? And she hadn't thought of that. She'd just been roughed up in the chamber. She assumed it was because she was a woman. In fact, it was because she was useless.
Well, what do you say, though, Anne, to people who point at, say, STEM subjects and the fact that girls still, even today, are less likely to go into certain subject areas because there might be a perception that it's not for them? Do you have any sympathy with that perspective?
Not really. I mean, I think there was a time, and there seriously was a time when, for example, it was quite pioneering if you were a woman engineer, or even, you know, if you were a woman prison officer. When I was first prisons minister, there weren't that many, certainly not working in men's prisons. So, yes, I mean, I have huge respect for people who pioneer, but there is an enormous difference between that and saying, simply because there are not enough women doing something, it must be because they're women, instead of simply respecting choices. Now, a lot of women reject going into Parliament, not because they're incapable of it, but because they actually happen to give a priority to families. And if you've got a constituency in Yorkshire and you've got to be in London, very, very difficult to manage a family. That is their choice. We should respect that choice, not lament it. And it's up to individuals what they want to do. There's virtually no glass ceiling now. It's a load of nonsense. And there are virtually no barriers except when people decide that there are. And that's what that woman did in the corridor in the House of Commons. She decided there was a barrier. There wasn't.
I completely take your point about all the progress that has been made. But one thing that I would say is that of late, and certainly over the past few years, I have seen a rise in misogyny from people who are claiming that we can't define what a woman is. I mean, you talk to Keir Starmer and Annalise Dodds and various politicians. They can't seem to define the word. Isn't that something that women and feminists and International Women's Day could address?
Well, I don't think you need an International Women's Day to do it. You just need a cold dose of common sense. I mean, to me, it's quite obvious what a woman is. A woman produces eggs. A woman grows a baby in a womb. A woman gives birth. A woman breastfeeds. Now, a man can't do any of that. Therefore, it's quite clear to me what's a woman and what's a man. And I've every sympathy in the world with somebody who's a genuine trans and then has gone from one to the other and has gone through all the horrible processes and all the rest of it. I've a tremendous respect for that. But I've no respect for somebody who says, oh, I think I'm a woman, you know, I'll go into the women's changing rooms. Rubbish. Rubbish. And what's the matter with these women in Parliament? They can't define what a woman is. What the heck are they doing in Parliament?
I mean, that has been an interesting thing for me. And the last Labour Party conference became about cervixes, mostly, people having conversations about cervixes. It seems like a major distraction from the actual political issues that we should be talking about.
Are they cervixes or are they cervices? I've no idea.
That's a very good question. That is actually the key question here, I think.
Yeah, but it is just such a load of nonsense. And what is absent from all this debate is common sense. As I say, we've won, and yet people are still looking for sources of grievance, and they're finding them in the most unlikely quarters. And the idea that nobody knows what a woman is, and I actually think, beyond it being phenomenally stupid, when that is being taught to children, I think that's actually quite dangerous. When you're saying to children you can't define a man and a woman, of course you